The sky was painted in soft blue that afternoon, and the golden rays of the sun reflected on the clear water of the sea. Clara arrived at the gates of one of the most famous resorts in the city. It was the kind of place where people came to show off their wealth, to sit near the pool in expensive sunglasses, and to order bottles of drinks that cost more than most people earned in a week. For Clara, however, the place was not about the show. She simply wanted a quiet afternoon to feel the ocean breeze, listen to the sound of waves, and enjoy a refreshing drink. Clara looked simple compared to the other guests. She wore a light cotton summer dress that flowed in the wind, and her hair was tied back neatly. She didn't wear heavy jewelry, only a thin bracelet her mother had given her years ago. Her handbag was small, not a famous brand, just something she liked for its comfort. Anyone watching her could see she was different from the crowd. People arrived at the resort in large cars, with bodyguards opening their doors, carrying designer luggage, and wearing clothes that screamed wealth. Clara stepped out of a regular taxi, thanked the driver kindly, and walked toward the reception with a smile on her face. From the moment she entered, the eyes of the staff followed her. The receptionist, a young woman with a polished look, raised her brows slightly. She leaned closer to the manager and whispered something. The manager, a man in his 40s with sharp features and a proud air, looked at Clara and gave a small smirk. In their eyes, she didn't belong. Clara, however, didn't notice. She was too busy admiring the beauty of the lobby, the tall glass windows, the paintings on the walls, the smell of fresh flowers placed neatly on the tables. She walked up to the reception desk with confidence, though her tone remained soft and polite. "Good afternoon," she said. "I was hoping to sit by the pool and order a drink while I wait for my husband." The receptionist blinked, clearly surprised. "Do you have a membership card?" she asked, her voice slightly cold. Clara shook her head gently. "No, but my husband told me to wait for him here. He will be joining me soon." The receptionist gave a forced smile, the kind of smile that hid judgment. "Well, this is a private resort. Normally, people cannot simply come in without membership or a reservation." Clara nodded politely. "I understand. But I will not be staying long. Just a drink by the pool is all I need." The manager, who had been listening from a distance, walked closer. His eyes scanned Clara from head to toe, her simple dress, her modest bag, and her calm face. He had seen many wealthy people in his career, and to him, Clara looked nothing like them. He assumed she was just an ordinary woman trying to enjoy luxuries she could not afford. "Madam," the manager said, his voice firm, "this is not a public place. People cannot just walk in." Clara looked at him calmly. "I understand, sir. But as I said, I am waiting for my husband. He asked me to meet him here." The manager chuckled under his breath. "Of course, your husband. And where is this husband of yours? If he is truly a member, why isn't he here with you?" Clara smiled faintly, though his words carried a hint of insult. "He will be here soon. I am a little early." At that moment, a group of wealthy guests walked past. They were dressed in bright designer clothes, carrying shopping bags from expensive stores. One of the women in the group noticed Clara and gave a mocking laugh. She whispered to her friend, loud enough for Clara to hear, "Looks like they let anyone in these days." Clara heard it but didn't react. She had grown used to such comments. She believed in her dignity, and she didn't allow the rudeness of strangers to shake her peace. Still, she quietly walked toward the poolside and sat down at the far end, away from the crowd. She placed her bag on the chair and looked out at the sea. The waves moved gently, and the salty air brushed her face. A waiter came by with a menu. His tone was impatient. "What will you have?" Clara smiled kindly. "Just a lemonade, please." The waiter almost rolled his eyes. That's all. He expected someone at a resort like this to order expensive cocktails or champagne. To him, Clara's choice was another sign that she didn't belong. Clara nodded. Yes, just a lemonade. Thank you. He walked away, muttering something under his breath. Clara didn't hear, or maybe she chose not to. She leaned back in the chair and closed her eyes for a moment. She wasn't there for attention or to prove herself. She was there for the calm, the air, and the ocean view. Meanwhile, at the reception, the staff continued whispering. One of them said, "She probably sneaked in. Look at her, no jewelry, no designer bag. She must have lied about her husband." The manager nodded in agreement, convinced Clara was just another outsider trying to taste a life that wasn't hers. Back by the pool, Clara noticed how some guests were staring. Some gave her sharp looks, while others laughed quietly, pointing in her direction. Yet she remained calm. She had a secret, one that nobody there knew. She didn't need to shout, argue, or prove herself. She just had to wait. The lemonade arrived, and she thanked the waiter with genuine kindness. She took a sip and smiled softly, enjoying the cool taste. But even as she sat quietly, she could feel the heavy air of judgment surrounding her. People whispered, staff stared, and the manager kept watching her like she was a mistake waiting to be corrected. The minutes passed slowly. Clara didn't rush. She didn't let the discomfort ruin her peace. She thought about her husband, how he always told her not to bother with appearances. True worth, he often said, is not worn on the outside. It lives inside you. Clara believed in those words deeply. But the resort was not a place of patience. Soon, one of the wealthy guests, the same woman who had mocked her earlier, walked straight to the manager. Pointing at Clara, she complained loudly, "Why is she here? She doesn't belong. This is supposed to be exclusive. People like her should not be sitting next to us." Clara could hear every word, but she didn't flinch. She simply sat there, her lemonade glass resting on the table, her eyes still on the sea. The manager now felt pressure. The wealthy guests were complaining, and he didn't want to lose their favor. He straightened his suit and began walking toward Clara with firm steps. The other staff members watched with interest, ready to see what would happen next. Clara sat there, quiet and calm, completely unaware that her day was about to change in ways no one in the resort could have imagined. The calmness around Clara did not last long. The manager, who had been standing at the reception with his arms folded, finally walked over to her. His steps were firm, his face tight, and his tone full of authority. People around the pool turned their heads, curious to see what would happen. Some of the wealthy guests leaned back in their chairs, sipping their drinks, secretly excited to watch Clara be embarrassed. For them, it was entertainment. The manager stopped right in front of Clara's table. "Madam," he said in a sharp voice, "I must remind you again that this is a private luxury resort. Only members and registered guests are allowed to use our facilities. May I see your membership card or reservation details?" Clara opened her eyes slowly and looked up at him. Her calm expression didn't change. "As I told you earlier," she said gently, "I don't have a membership card with me. My husband asked me to meet him here. I came early. I will be leaving with him." The manager smirked. His eyes carried disbelief. "Yes, of course, your husband. Every person we ask for proof always has the same story. My husband this, my friend that." He leaned closer. "But you see, this resort has standards. We cannot allow just anyone to sit here and disturb the atmosphere." Clara raised her eyebrows slightly. "Disturb the atmosphere? I am only sitting here quietly, drinking lemonade. I haven't caused any trouble." The manager gave a small laugh that wasn't kind at all. "You may not think so, but other guests are not comfortable. They expect a certain class of people here." Clara's lips curved into a faint smile, though her eyes showed a trace of sadness. "And you think I am not of that class?" Before the manager could answer, the same wealthy woman who had been mocking Clara earlier stepped forward. She wore a golden necklace and held a glass of wine. She placed her hand on the manager's arm and said loudly, "Why are you wasting time? Look at her. She clearly doesn't belong. Remove her before she ruins the experience for the rest of us." Other guests chuckled softly, agreeing with the woman. Some nodded their heads, whispering about Clara as if she were invisible. Clara heard every word, but she stayed silent, her dignity untouched. The manager, feeling encouraged by the support of the wealthy woman, straightened his back. "You heard the guests," he said firmly. "Please leave the premises immediately." Clara's calm voice replied, "You are making a mistake. My husband will be here soon." The manager lost patience. His tone grew sharper. "Madam, enough of this game. If you don't leave on your own, I will have to ask security to escort you out." At his signal, 2 security guards in black uniforms approached. They were tall, serious-looking men, trained to handle situations quickly. People around the pool began whispering louder now, enjoying the scene. To them, Clara was just another ordinary woman trying to sneak into a world she didn't deserve. One of the guards stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said in a low but firm tone, "please come with us." Clara didn't fight back. She didn't raise her voice or argue. She picked up her small handbag, stood up gracefully, and nodded. "Very well," she said softly. "If you insist." As she walked with the guards toward the exit, the wealthy woman who had complained smirked and whispered to her friend, "See? This is why they need rules. Otherwise, people like her would sit next to us." The friend laughed quietly. Imagine, coming here in such a plain dress. What was she thinking? Clara heard their words, but her face remained calm. She didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her upset. Inside, however, she felt a quiet ache. Not for herself, but for the cruelty of people who judged others without knowing their story. The guards led her through the lobby. Some of the staff members standing near the reception couldn't hide their amusement. They whispered to each other, their eyes following Clara until the glass doors closed behind her. Outside the resort, the world was quieter. Clara stepped into the sunlight, the soft breeze brushing her face. The guards didn't push her, they simply stood by the door, making sure she walked away. Clara turned back once, gave them a small polite nod, and then began walking slowly toward the docks near the sea. She didn't hurry. Each step was calm, steady, filled with grace. She could have called her husband immediately, told him what happened, and asked him to come right away. But Clara wasn't a person who acted in anger. She believed that time always revealed the truth. She trusted her husband would arrive soon, and when he did, everything would come to light. At the poolside, the wealthy guests continued with their drinks and laughter. The woman with the golden necklace raised her glass in victory, saying, "That's better. Now we can enjoy in peace." The manager, proud of himself, adjusted his suit and returned to his desk. The staff, too, relaxed, believing they had handled the situation correctly. But what none of them knew was that their arrogance had just written their downfall. Clara was not an ordinary woman pretending to belong. She was the beloved wife of a billionaire, a man whose name was known in every corner of the country. The very resort they worked in had once begged for his investment. And now, without realizing it, they had insulted the person most important to him. Clara reached the pier and sat down on the wooden edge. She placed her bag beside her and pulled out her phone. She typed a short message to her husband, "I am waiting by the docks. Take your time. I'll be here." Then she put her phone away and looked at the horizon. The sea stretched endlessly, calm and beautiful. The sound of waves comforted her, reminding her that nature didn't judge anyone by clothes, money, or appearance. The ocean welcomed everyone equally. She sat there quietly, letting the minutes pass. Behind her, the resort continued its noisy laughter, but around her, there was only peace. Clara didn't need to explain herself to people who couldn't see beyond appearances. She knew who she was, and more importantly, she knew who was coming for her. And while the resort staff believed they had solved a problem, they had unknowingly created the storm of their lives. Clara sat at the pier, her feet dangling slightly above the water. The boards of the dock were warm under the afternoon sun, and the smell of salt carried through the air. The soft cries of seagulls echoed above her, and every now and then a gentle wave brushed against the shore. She held her phone in her hand for a moment, staring at the short message she had already sent, "I'm waiting by the docks. Take your time." Then she put it back in her bag and let out a quiet sigh. There was no anger in her heart, no bitterness, even though she had just been humiliated in front of strangers. Clara had lived long enough to know that life was full of people who judged quickly and harshly. If she allowed every insult to hurt her deeply, she would never have peace. So instead, she focused on the sound of the sea, letting its rhythm wash over her and carry away the sting of the moment. Back at the resort, laughter and music floated in the air. Guests were relaxing on their lounge chairs, sipping colorful drinks, dipping their feet into the pool, and taking pictures to show off their glamorous lives. None of them thought about the woman they had just seen escorted out. To them, she was already forgotten, another face, another story. The manager felt proud of himself for protecting the resort's reputation. The wealthy woman who had complained earlier leaned back on her chair, her necklace glittering in the sunlight, satisfied that she had gotten her way. But Clara was not the kind of person to let bitterness fill her. Instead, she quietly observed the horizon, where the water stretched endlessly into the distance. Every few minutes, she looked up, watching small fishing boats move slowly along the coast. Children played on the beach nearby, building sand castles and laughing. Their joy reminded her of simpler times, long before her life became tied to wealth and power through her husband. She had always stayed the same, humble, calm, and kind-hearted. After half an hour, some of the resort staff noticed her still sitting at the dock. They pointed her out to one another, shaking their heads. "She's still here," one of the waiters whispered. "Didn't she get the message? This isn't her place." Another replied, "Maybe she's waiting for someone to pick her up in a taxi. She'll be gone soon." None of them had any idea who she was waiting for. None of them could imagine that the simple woman they dismissed so easily was the wife of one of the most powerful men in the region. An hour passed, and whispers spread among the guests as well. A few noticed the woman at the docks and laughed quietly among themselves. "She probably doesn't have anywhere to go," one guest said. "Look at her, sitting there like she owns the ocean." Another chuckled, "Maybe she thought if she pretends long enough, she'll be allowed back in. Poor thing." Their comments floated in the air, but Clara didn't react. Her calmness seemed almost unusual, like she knew something they didn't. She sat straight, her eyes on the horizon, her hands resting peacefully in her lap. Then, a soft buzz began among the people by the pool. Someone pointed toward the sea. "Look," a man exclaimed. "There's a huge yacht coming this way." All heads turned. In the distance, cutting through the blue waves, was a massive white yacht. Its size was so grand that it made the fishing boats look like toys beside it. Sunlight bounced off its polished surface, and the sound of its horn carried powerfully across the water. At first, the guests thought it was just another rich family arriving for vacation. Many yachts came and went, but this one was different. Its presence was commanding. People leaned forward in their chairs, some even standing up to get a better look. Phones were pulled out to take photos, and whispers grew louder with each passing minute. "Whose yacht is that?" one man asked. "I think I've seen it before," another guest replied. "Wait, isn't that the Eternity? That's Edward Hamilton's yacht." The name spread quickly among the guests. Edward Hamilton. Everyone knew him. A billionaire, a man whose companies touched nearly every corner of the economy. Hotels, airlines, real estate. His name was written in gold across countless buildings. He was a figure of wealth and influence, admired by some and feared by others. And now, his yacht was sailing directly toward the resort. The manager froze when he heard the whispers. His face grew pale, and his heart began to pound. He knew the name well. Everyone in the industry did. Edward Hamilton wasn't just wealthy, he was powerful. And he was known for being protective of his family. The yacht drew closer, its enormous form now impossible to ignore. The staff scrambled, suddenly nervous. They lined up at the edge of the dock, trying to look professional. Waiters smoothed their uniforms, and the manager straightened his tie repeatedly, sweat forming on his forehead. The wealthy guests who had laughed at Clara now stared with wide eyes, their drinks forgotten in their hands. Clara, still sitting on the dock, saw the yacht approaching and allowed herself a small smile. She stood up gracefully, brushing the sand from her dress, and waited. Her calmness contrasted with the growing tension at the resort. She didn't wave or call out. She simply stood still, like someone who already knew she belonged. When the yacht finally stopped near the dock, a line of uniformed crew members appeared. They set down a gangway with smooth precision, every movement practiced and perfect. The air grew thick with anticipation. Then, from the deck, a tall figure stepped forward. Edward Hamilton. He wore a simple but elegant linen suit, his posture straight, his presence impossible to ignore. His hair was brushed neatly, and his expression was serious, yet his eyes softened the moment they landed on Clara. Without hesitation, he walked down the gangway and approached her. Gasps filled the air. The guests, the staff, even the manager, everyone stared in shock. The same simple woman they had kicked out just an hour earlier was now revealed as the wife of one of the most powerful men in the country. Edward reached Clara, took her hand gently, and kissed her forehead. "I'm sorry I kept you waiting," he said softly. Clara smiled. "It's all right. I enjoyed the sea breeze." Their quiet exchange struck the crowd more than any loud declaration could have. It was clear, this woman, dressed simply and without display, was the most important person in the billionaire's life. Behind them, the manager's hands trembled. His pride from earlier disappeared completely. The wealthy woman who had mocked Clara dropped her glass, her necklace glittering uselessly under the sun as she struggled to process the truth. The truth had arrived, and it was grander than anything they could have imagined. And while the resort guests whispered in disbelief, Edward turned his head slowly toward the staff. His eyes, sharp and commanding, sent a silent message: something was about to change forever. The dock had fallen silent, as if the sea itself had paused to watch what would happen next. Edward Hamilton, the billionaire whose name echoed in the world of wealth and power, was standing before his wife Clara, holding her hand tenderly. Guests and staff alike were frozen, unable to believe their eyes. Just an hour ago, Clara had been thrown out like an outsider. Now, she stood at the center of attention, not as a stranger, but as the beloved wife of the man who owned more than any of them could imagine. Edward looked at Clara carefully, his eyes searching her face. "Are you all right, my love?" he asked in a gentle tone that contrasted sharply with his powerful presence. Clara nodded softly. "Yes, I'm fine. I was only waiting for you." He gave a small smile, though his jaw was tight with restrained anger. Edward was a man known for his calmness in business, but when it came to Clara, his emotions were different. He turned slowly toward the staff lined up nearby, his expression changing from warm to cold. "Who asked my wife to leave?" His voice was not raised, but it carried weight, the kind of authority that made every person in front of him shiver. The manager swallowed hard. He had been standing behind the line of staff, trying to look invisible, but Edward's eyes found him instantly. The manager stepped forward, his hands shaking slightly, his voice unsteady. "Yes, sir, I didn't realize, we didn't know she was your wife." Edward's gaze hardened. "So you judged her by her clothes, by her simplicity, and decided she was not worthy of being here. The manager tried to defend himself, his words stumbling. "It was a misunderstanding, sir." The other guests were uncomfortable. "I only wanted to maintain the standards of the resort." Edward cut him off with a sharp look. "Standards? You speak of standards, yet you humiliate a woman who sat quietly and caused no harm? That is not standard. That is arrogance. And arrogance has no place in hospitality." Gasps rippled through the guests. The wealthy woman who had mocked Clara earlier shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her face burning with embarrassment. She had been loud before, but now she remained silent, unable to meet Edward's eyes. Edward reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Without saying another word, he dialed a number. Everyone around him watched in stunned silence. After a moment, he spoke into the phone with calm authority. "Yes. This is Edward Hamilton. Get me the owner of this resort." The manager's face turned white. He knew what this meant. Within minutes, the owner would learn what had happened, and the consequences would be severe. Edward ended the call and turned back to Clara, his tone softening again. "Come, love. Let's sit while we wait." He led her to a seat by the dock. The crew from the yacht quickly brought out a chair and refreshments, treating Clara with the respect she deserved. She sat gracefully, her composure unshaken. She didn't look at the guests who had mocked her, nor at the staff who had thrown her out. Instead, she looked at the sea, the same calm expression on her face that she had carried all along. The contrast was striking. Clara, simple and kind, didn't need to raise her voice or show off wealth. Her dignity spoke louder than anything else. And beside her, Edward's presence made it clear that the woman they had disrespected was more powerful than all of them combined. The silence around the pool grew heavy. Guests whispered quietly to one another, some in shock, others in regret. They had laughed at Clara, looked down on her, and dismissed her, and now they realized they had judged without knowing. Within 20 minutes, a luxury car pulled up at the entrance. The resort owner, a man in his 50s, stepped out hurriedly. He wore an expensive suit, but his face was pale with worry. He had received Edward's call, and he knew this was no small matter. He rushed to the dock, bowing slightly as he approached. "Mr. Hamilton," he said breathlessly, "I came as soon as I heard. Please, forgive whatever mistake was made. I assure you this was not intentional." Edward stood up slowly. "Your staff insulted my wife. They threw her out of your resort, humiliated her in front of your guests, because they judged her by her appearance. Tell me, is this how you run your business?" The owner glanced nervously at Clara, then at the staff, who stood trembling. He shook his head quickly. "No, sir, absolutely not. This is unacceptable. I promise you, those responsible will face consequences immediately." Edward's voice remained steady. "Consequences will not erase the insult. This resort stands on service, on hospitality, on respect. Yet here, you allowed arrogance and prejudice to take its place. Tell me, why should such a place continue under your management?" The owner stammered. "Please, Mr. Hamilton, give me a chance to correct this. We will retrain the staff, we will." Edward raised his hand, silencing him. "No. You've already had your chance. I will not tolerate such treatment toward my wife, or anyone, for that matter. This resort will not remain in your hands. I'm finalizing my plans to buy this property, and once the deal is done, you and your management will no longer be here." The guests gasped again. Some couldn't believe what they were hearing. The owner himself looked as though the ground had been pulled out from under him. Edward turned to Clara, his expression softening again. "This place will be rebuilt in your name, Clara. A place where people will feel welcome, not judged." Clara gave him a gentle smile, though her humility remained. "Edward, I don't need my name on buildings. I only want people to be treated kindly." Edward nodded. And that is exactly what will happen. The staff who had mocked Clara earlier felt their legs weaken. They exchanged terrified glances, realizing their arrogance had cost them everything. The manager, who had been so confident and proud just hours ago, now stood trembling, knowing his career was finished. The wealthy woman who had complained the loudest about Clara lowered her head in shame. She clutched her glass tightly, her earlier confidence gone. Guests who had laughed quietly at Clara now sat in regret, wishing they had treated her differently. Edward held Clara's hand once more. "Let's go," he said softly. "We don't need to stay here any longer." Together, they walked toward the yacht, hand in hand. The crew saluted them with respect as they stepped aboard. Clara turned once to look back at the resort. She didn't look with anger or pride, only with quiet reflection. She had no desire for revenge. She only hoped those who had mocked her would learn something from what had happened. The yacht began to move away, its powerful engines humming as it cut through the waves. The sun glistened on the water, casting a golden path ahead of them. Guests and staff watched in silence, the image of Clara and Edward leaving together etched in their minds forever. At the dock, the resort owner stood frozen, his future uncertain. The manager lowered his head, regret burning in his chest. And the wealthy guests whispered among themselves, realizing they had witnessed a lesson money could never buy: true worth is never measured by appearances. Clara sat beside Edward on the yacht, holding his hand. The breeze touched her face, and she smiled gently. She didn't need luxury to feel rich. She had love, dignity, and peace, and those were treasures no money could buy. The sun began to set slowly, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink as Edward's yacht moved farther away from the resort. The water shimmered under the fading light, and the breeze carried the salty scent of the ocean. Clara sat on the deck, her hand resting in Edward's, her heart steady and calm. To her, the day had been long and uncomfortable, but it had also revealed something powerful: how quickly people judged others, and how wrong those judgments could be. Edward watched her quietly for a moment. He could still see the calmness in her eyes, though he knew she had been disrespected deeply. "I am sorry, Clara," he said finally, his voice low and serious. "You should never have been treated that way. You deserve respect, always." Clara gave him a small smile. "Edward, you don't need to apologize. I know who I am, and I don't need their approval. People like that see only the surface. They don't know the heart." Her words made Edward's chest tighten with admiration. This was one of the many reasons he loved her. She had never cared about appearances, wealth, or status. She lived with humility, dignity, and kindness, even when others treated her unfairly. But Edward was not as forgiving as Clara. He leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. "Still, they must learn. That resort will no longer belong to those who allowed such arrogance. When the papers are signed, it will be under your care. And it will be a place where no one is made to feel small." Clara looked at him softly, her voice gentle. "Then let it be a place of kindness, Edward. Promise me that. Don't turn it into punishment. Let it become a reminder that people can be better." Edward nodded slowly. "If that is what you want, then that is what it will be." As the yacht cut through the waves, the crew moved quietly around them, preparing dinner. Some of the staff stole glances at Clara, their faces respectful. They knew her now not only as the wife of a powerful man but as a woman who carried herself with quiet strength. Meanwhile, back at the resort, the air was heavy with regret. The manager sat alone in his office, his head in his hands. The owner had left in silence, unable to face the guests or the staff. The wealthy woman who had mocked Clara earlier avoided everyone's eyes, her pride shattered. Guests whispered to one another, replaying what they had seen. The simple woman they had laughed at was the wife of Edward Hamilton, and they had all witnessed the humiliation that would now change everything. Some felt guilty. Others felt embarrassed. And some, silently, promised themselves they would never judge anyone so quickly again. 2 days later, the news broke. Headlines filled the newspapers and business magazines. Edward Hamilton acquires coastal resort after wife faces disrespect. Reporters covered the story endlessly, amazed at how such a small act of arrogance had led to such a massive shift. People across the country read the story. Many admired Clara for her grace, her silence, and her strength. Others admired Edward for standing by his wife so firmly. And together, they became an example, a reminder that respect should not be given only to those who wear expensive clothes or carry famous names. Respect should be given to every human being. When Edward and Clara returned to the resort a month later, the place was different. The staff who had mocked her were no longer there. The new management had been carefully selected. Clara's wish had been honored. The resort was no longer a place of cold judgment. It was warm, welcoming, and open to people from all walks of life. As Clara walked through the lobby again, the new staff greeted her with genuine kindness. Not because she was Edward Hamilton's wife, but because they had been trained to see value in every person. Clara felt a sense of peace. She hadn't needed revenge, only change. And now, change had come. Edward walked beside her, proud. He leaned close and whispered, "Do you see, love? This is your gift. You turned their arrogance into a lesson for the world." Clara smiled softly. "No, Edward. It wasn't me. It was life showing them that appearances mean nothing. One day, they will truly understand." As they moved toward the balcony, they saw guests enjoying themselves by the pool. This time, no one looked at others with superiority. No one whispered cruel jokes. People laughed, families smiled, and children played freely. The atmosphere was lighter, brighter, full of the kind of peace Clara had always carried in her own heart. Later that evening, as the sun set once again, Edward and Clara stood at the edge of the balcony, watching the waves. Edward wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "You know," he said softly, "the day they insulted you, I was angrier than I've ever been. But now, looking at this, I realize your way was better. You wanted kindness, not punishment. And you were right." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. "Wealth may build walls, Edward, but kindness breaks them down. That is what the world needs." He kissed her forehead gently. "And that is why I will always follow your heart." The resort, once a symbol of arrogance, became known as a place of equality and respect. People came not only for luxury but also for the warmth they felt there. Stories spread of Clara's dignity, how she had been thrown out yet never lost her grace, and how she had inspired her husband to rebuild the place with kindness at its core. Guests who had been there on the day of the incident never forgot what they saw. They told the story to their friends, their families, and their children, how a woman dressed simply, mocked and humiliated, turned out to be the wife of a billionaire, and how that single event changed everything. The wealthy woman who had mocked Clara disappeared from social circles for a while, too embarrassed to face questions. Some said she moved away, ashamed of how her pride had destroyed her reputation. The manager, too, never worked in the same industry again. His arrogance had cost him dearly, and his name became a warning to others: never judge a guest by their appearance. But for Clara, none of that mattered. She never spoke of the incident again. She didn't celebrate the downfall of those who had mistreated her, nor did she boast about the new resort. She continued to live her life the same way she always had, with simplicity, humility, and quiet dignity. One evening, sitting on the deck of the yacht as the waves rolled gently below, Edward asked her, "Do you ever think about that day?" Clara smiled softly. "Yes, sometimes. Not with anger. Just as a reminder. That day showed me that kindness is the only answer. Because even when the world judges, you must stay true to yourself. That is the greatest victory." Edward looked at her with admiration. He knew that all his wealth, all his power, meant nothing without her. Clara was his true treasure, the one who reminded him that life was not about luxury, but about humanity. The yacht sailed into the horizon, carrying them forward, just as their love carried them through every storm. Behind them, the resort stood tall, no longer a place of arrogance, but a place of learning, humility, and respect. And the lesson that remained, in the hearts of all who had witnessed it, was simple yet powerful: never judge a person by how they look, for the one you look down upon today might be the one who owns the very world you admire tomorrow.